the 2020 and 2021 graduating classes specifically, repayment is kind of a new experience, right? You haven't experienced what student loan repayment actually looks like. So this is gonna be a little tricky. If you didn't do anything with your student loans since graduation, then you're probably gonna get a scary statement in January that says you have a standard 10-year monthly payment due, right? Because that still is the default repayment plan for anyone who doesn't choose another type of repayment plan after your grace period ends.
That is student debt expert and VIN Foundation board member, Dr. Tony Bartels. And this is the VIN Foundation's Veterinary Pulse podcast, special student debt series. I'm Jordan benShea, Executive Director of the VIN Foundation. Join me and our co-host and VIN Foundation board member, Dr. Matt Holland, as we talk with veterinary colleagues about critical topics and share stories that connect us as humans, as animals, as a veterinary community. This podcast is made possible by individuals like you who donate to the VIN Foundation. Thank you. Please check the episode notes for bios, links, and information mentioned. Hey, Tony, welcome back.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me. This has been become a frequent occurrence with all.
It's becoming a series.
Yeah, exactly, and not by intention necessarily. This
definitely not.
All has to do with the changes that have been going on with federal student loans and repayment recently.
Exactly, and there's a lot of changes, way more in the news than we usually see.
Yep.
Who thought that a pandemic would impact these things so vastly?
Yeah.
So we're here to talk about the Student Loan Repayment Extension, and let's just dive right in like we always do. What's the latest?
So the latest is that the pandemic forbearance, so basically the pause of payments and interest on federal student loans or federally held student loans, has been extended through January 31st of 2022. And the Department of Education on their website calls this the quote final extension. So that usually, yeah, well, anytime you mark anything as final is usually an indication that that's not going to be the case. Right. But I think they're going to try to make this the final one. But, of course, as we've all seen, they can't really control the pandemic. So, it depends on what's going on around that time frame as to whether or not this will truly be the final extension. But, right now it's labeled as such. So that's the first time they've tried that.
Okay. And who does this news impact the most? Is it everybody with student loans? I mean, you said specifically federal student loans. So for those with federal student loans, is there a specific group that it impacts more than others? Who do you see as the low-hanging fruit of impact here?
Well, the impact is, and it has been, to what are considered to be federally held student loans. So you can have federal student loans that are not held by the Department of Education. But hopefully, since this has been in place for, well over a year now, most people have kind of figured out if they have the type of loans that are subject to the pandemic forbearance benefits versus those that don't. Most of the non-federally held loans that live in the federal student loan database are those for people who went to school prior to 2010. If you had some of the federal family education loans, sometimes those are federally held, sometimes not. And if you have some of the ones that are not federally held, then they wouldn't be eligible for the 0% interest rates and the payment suspension. But you could, if you wanted to, consolidate those into a direct consolidation loan. But again, at this point, since we're arriving or potentially approaching the end of this pandemic forbearance, I would definitely want to check in with somebody before you go ahead and do that.
So you said there's a difference between having federal loans and having federally held student loans. What is the easiest way, if somebody still at this point doesn't know, what's the quickest and easiest way for them to check that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you should have, you'll be familiar now. Like I have some, I have a very small balance from my undergraduate education of non-federally held student loans, and those are still in repayment. right? I'm still accruing interest on them. I'm still have an automatic payment set for those, and those have kind of been continuing on in repayment like the pandemic forbearance never happened, right? So if you have non-federally held loans, then chances are those are still in repayment, right? So anybody that has federally held loans, that pandemic forbearance has automatically been applied, right? So that you didn't have to do anything. They would have automatically turned off your payments and automatically set your interest rates to zero. One of the other ways that you can tell is if you obtain your federal student aid data file, that will still contain both federally held and non-federally held loans. And if you upload it to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, in the loan servicers tab, you can actually see who holds your federal student loan. So anything that's held by the Department of Education, a federally held loan, will have Department of Ed at the beginning of that loan servicer name.
Got it. So anyone that's got private loans or federal loans that are not held, they're still paying as regular. They haven't had this sweet period of no payment.
Right. Now, there is some variability there. So some of the private lenders have put a, kind of a deferment, or made a deferment eligible for you if you wanted to take it. But those are highly specific to the loan type that you have, right? So the federally held loans are all consistently have the pandemic forbearance consistently applied across them.
Okay, so what should colleagues do now for all the repayment plans for the federally held loans to make sure they're ready for January? And I know that we ask this question whenever we have part of the Student Debt Series podcast, but I feel as though there's got to be some people that are just like, oh, well, I don't have to pay anything, so I'm just going to not think about it. So as you know, if this is, dare we say, the final extension, how should our colleagues be prepping for it?
Yeah, so I would still enjoy the remaining non-payments and the fact that interest is not accruing. But you want to start thinking about what repayment looked like before the pandemic forbearance period for you. So if you had a monthly payment due prior to the pandemic forbearance period starting, then that's going to be the monthly payment that starts presumably in February of 2022 when the pandemic forbearance period ends. So, start looking at, digging up that information. What was my monthly payment before the pandemic forbearance period started? Again, if you lost track of that, you can obtain your federal student aid data file and upload it to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, and it'll show you what your monthly payment was prior, and the repayment plan that you were using prior to the pandemic forbearance period starting. Update your budget, right? So make sure that you're prepared to have that payment hit your budget as it currently exists. Again, if that happens in February. But just getting familiar with all of the information that you had prior to the pandemic forbearance period taking effect.
So that's really helpful for colleagues who have paid student loans before. But now we are seeing not only one, but two graduating classes from veterinary school come out. And both of those classes, for class of 2020 and class of 2021, have never paid student loans, right?
Yeah.
So for those colleagues who have never paid those student loans due to forbearance period, how do you recommend they use this time?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that we do have to point that out specifically, that, the 2020 and 2021 graduating classes specifically, repayment is kind of a new experience, right? You haven't experienced what student loan repayment actually looks like. So this is gonna be a little tricky. If you didn't do anything with your student loans since graduation, then you're probably gonna get a scary statement in January that says you have a standard 10-year monthly payment due, right? Because that still is the default repayment plan for anyone who doesn't choose another type of repayment plan after your grace period ends, right? So if you graduated into the pandemic forbearance period in 2020 or 2021, you still had a grace period, and that grace period still end or will end in a couple of months here, and your loans will kind of automatically go into that standard 10-year repayment plan. But again, you won't have a payment due until the pandemic forbearance period officially ends. So you have to pay a little bit of extra special attention to prevent having that what could be a significant monthly payment due once the pandemic forbearance period ends. So that's where, we try to get new graduates specifically through the new grad playbook webinar that we do to graduate, consolidate, and apply for an income-driven repayment plan, right? So you can still do that during the pandemic forbearance period, and you will still benefit from the no interest and no payment due. You just can control which repayment plan you're in, as well as the loan servicer that you're using after repayment starts.
Yeah, and we will do, everything that Tony's mentioning, as you guys know, we will put the links and information in the episode notes. And we will also do a webinar. As we get close to this end of January time, we will do a webinar on what to do, what to look out for, especially for those that have never paid.
Right.
So that when you get that scary notice, we're at least here to help you a little bit. So this is, of course, not the only news for student loan borrowers. We've heard of a few loan servicers now, not just Fed Loan, who are not going to be servicing loans after this year. How does that play into this continued extension? Because it sounds like we have some loan servicers who are going to stop servicing loans before the end of this year, right, in December, but yet the forbearance continues into January. That seems a little tricky. How do we begin to navigate that?
Yeah, so that is also complicating things, and I believe that's probably one of the major reasons why the pandemic forbearance was extended for another several months. Anyway, was because we have two loan servicers that have announced so far that they're no longer going to service federal student loans by the end of the year, and the big one being Fed Loan Servicing. So the other one is Granite State. So if you have either Fed Loan Servicing or Granite State, then you want to, again, pay extra special attention to what's going on as repayment restarts. Because if you have one of those two loan servicers, either one of those two loan servicers, your loans are going to get moved before the end of this year. And unfortunately, mistakes get made when loans get moved from one loan servicer to another. The particularly complicating factor this time around is Fed Loan Servicing is one of the biggest loan servicers, right? So they service the most balance of federal student loans out there, as well as the highest number of borrowers out there. So they're one of the major loan servicers, and they were also the loan servicer who was tasked with officially monitoring public service loan forgiveness progress. So this is a pretty big bomb being dropped for borrowers, particularly those who have Fed Loan Servicing, and the chances are quite high that you might, as well as anyone who's working towards public service loan forgiveness.
So is it possible that new graduates from class of 2020 and 2021 have Fed Loan, have never had to make a payment, and now they are going to need to find a loan servicer all before they even have to make a payment?
Well, there's a good chance that many recent graduates have Fed Loan Servicing just by odds that they're one of the biggest loan servicers, but also because we've been recommending that people choose them as their loan servicer as part of their consolidation process. And that was mostly because of their role with monitoring public service loan forgiveness progress. Right. So unfortunately, none of the loan servicers are very good at administering the income-driven repayment plans. And that's part of the reason why a couple of them are quitting, because it takes a lot of time, effort, and money to administer these very complicated repayment programs. Now, there's no way we could see that happening.
Of course not. Right.
Of course, whenever the Department of Education comes out and says whoever the next official monitor of public service loan forgiveness is going to be, that's probably who we're going to recommend going forward after you consolidate your loans. But you don't, except for the consolidation process, you don't have the ability to choose your loan servicer. Right. So anyone who has Fed Loan Servicing now, who's in repayment, or who has Granite State management, your loans are going to get moved automatically and probably randomly reassigned to a different loan servicer. Now, if you have public service loan forgiveness qualifying time, they may make sure that you get moved to whoever they're going to deem as the public service loan forgiveness monitor going forward, but we don't know that yet, right? So the only thing that you can do right now is just information gathering. right? So go into your Fed loan servicing account, go into your granted state student loan account, download as many of the statements as you possibly have access to. If you don't have access to all of them, you want to request an entire log of your repayment history with that loan servicer. I would make sure that all of your contact information is up to date. So your email,
your address, yeah,
all of that stuff, your phone number with your loan servicers, as well as in the studentloans.gov portal, right? Because that's going to be where they go to grab the your contact information when they're going to start rolling out, hey, we're moving your loans from Fed loan servicing to somebody else, or hey, repayments being restarted. So you want to make sure that that information's up to date anyway, so you're receiving all of the communications that's going to be happening as those loans get moved and as we all re-enter repayment.
Yeah, there's so much. And yeah, of course, we never would have recommended Fed loan if we had any idea. And, I say you're welcome sarcastically, but we feel horrible just for anyone being in this situation. And we are here to help you. I assure you that you're not alone. So where can colleagues go for updates?
So the best place to go for an update right now is the studentaid.gov website. So studentaid.gov is right at the top of the page. They have a link to all of the announcements pertaining to the pandemic forbearance, and that page is actually quite good in terms of providing very detailed answers to many of the common questions that come up, no matter where you are in the borrowing or repayment process. So that's the first place I would start. But that's also where you go to log in to studentaid.gov to find your student aid data file. That's where you want to check and make sure that your contact information is up to date. So your email, your address, so they can contact you with all of the information pertaining to the end of the pandemic forbearance and loans being moved if your loans are serviced by Fed loan servicing or granted state. I would also check out vinfoundation.org and the blog posts that we put up periodically, as well as these podcasts. And the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center really is designed to help you make sense of all this. So if you grab that student aid data file, you can upload it to the My Student Loans tool. You can see the loan summary you have, which repayment plan you were using prior to the pandemic forbearance, which income-driven repayment plans you're eligible to use, who your loan servicers are, whether or not you have federally held loans versus not. All of that information is presented in an easy to understand way. And then of course you can start to simulate your repayment, sending that information over to the student loan repayment simulator to see which repayment strategy is going to be best for you once the pandemic forbearance period ends. And if you need help with any of that, then there's also a link to the student debt message board area where we've been providing personalized assistance to our veterinary colleagues.
Yes, and that is available. You don't need to have a VIN membership for that. That is on VIN, but it's in a separate area where it doesn't have access to the full community. If you're not a VIN member, you can get access through VIN Foundation access. We just have a couple of questions to just get you a login. And all those links are in the episode notes. So like with everything the VIN Foundation does, it's all free for veterinary colleagues at every stage. So we are here to help you, and make sure you check out those links. Is there anything else you think our listeners need to know about this news, Tony?
Yeah, no, I think it's just I know it sounds like a lot, and there is a lot going on, but again, take a deep breath. It's a great time to kind of reassess your budget as you're going to roll into, eventually we're all going to have to start paying back our student loans at some point here. So making sure that that's going to fit into your budget, but also taking stock of whether or not you're using the appropriate loan repayment strategy for your circumstances. So, and we're here to help. So I think that, ask questions, take a deep breath. We have answers to most of the questions that everybody's been asking during this confusing time when it comes to student loans, and there's definitely resources and colleagues out there that can help you work through all of this.
Absolutely. And we're here to help. You're not alone. All those links are there. Feel free to reach out. We have a lot of resources to help you. And if we don't know the answer, we'll do our best to find it for you. Thanks so much for joining us again, Tony, for the student debt series, the debt doctor series. We're going to need to start naming these something.
Right. Well, thanks again for having me. And we look forward to helping in any way we can.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Veterinary Pulse. Please check the episode notes for additional information referenced in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share review. We welcome feedback and hope you will tune in again. You can find out more about the VIN Foundation through our website, vinfoundation.org, and our social media channels. Thank you for being here. Be well.